involved here. Jason Beardsley, who I've met in the last, I guess, year, and come to know who he is. He lives in Ohio. He's a former Master Sergeant, and he's got over 22 years of special operations and military intelligence. He is a consultant to our government, and he knows a lot more than most of them know. So, Jason, I want you to fill in whatever blanks. I'm sure I made that really brief.
I don't know if we'll have a microphone up and working, but if it goes on, that'll make it a little bit easier. I'll just put it in there, and while you guys work on the technical issues, we'll go at it. Can you guys hear me from the back? Okay?
Yes,
great.
You're good.
All right, well, we'll just go like this for now, and I'll do a little bit. Thank you for that introduction, Kelly. I started my career in 1990 during the Persian Gulf War. That was an easy one. We won that without too much deliberation. And I always wanted to be in special operations. It didn't work out then, so I flipped into the Army and spent the next really somewhat like 20 years doing special forces. I did a lot of National Guard time, some contract work. So anybody see the movie 13 Hours? Yeah. Okay, so similar, a very kind of similar stance that a lot of us did. And in that time and beyond, with JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, I had the opportunity to work with some of the greatest of America's elite forces. I was in a unit that was pretty specialized, and we did a lot of work in different places that was a little bit clandestine, covert. So CIA, State Department, SEAL Team 6, Delta Force, you name it. Bumping up with ambassadors and CIA station chiefs and really running policy to counter terrorism on the leading edge of the battlefield and usually beyond the leading edge, so sometimes well deep into enemy territory. For me, it was a pleasure, it was an honor. It's what I want to do. It's a service I wanted to do since I was a kid. And because it meant that much to me, I always want to honor our military vets in any community organization. Right now, if you were a veteran or you served in the military, will you just raise your hand tonight? I love seeing that. It's important to me to find, do we have Korea War vets here with us this evening? Any Korea War? Okay, how about Vietnam? Raise your hands if you're Vietnam. Keep them up for me. It's important to me, keep those hands up, guys. If you're in Vietnam, it's important for me to tell you because we didn't do it when you came back home. And every time I get a chance in an audience, we owe you guys a service, a debt of gratitude for your service and thanks. And when you came home from the war, you didn't get the same treatment I got, and you didn't get the same thanks. It was a shame, and it was a shame on all of us. So from me to you, I just want to say thank you for that service tonight. Thank you. You guys are heroes to us. So those of us who, I know a couple in the room, Sean in the back, and a few of us others, we're inspired by men and women such as yourself that went before us. So we always want to honor that. I think that my take on history, we get the opportunity to honor those who went before us. It's important to kind of remember that, like Lincoln said, or even well before him, like Thucydides said about the funeral oration of Pericles. He said something like, we really can't honor guys who served, or women who served and fell on the battlefield or did great deeds by a podium or a 5-minute speech or the words that we write, because it cannot ever live up to their service. What does live up to their service is what we do when they either return home or they don't return home, and what we do to honor their service in our civic community. That's what we're here about tonight. That's what the Concerned Veterans is about. That's what my company's about. That's what I think a lot of us are stand for. How do we honor the service of men and women who have gone before us, fallen in battle, sometimes left some, and sometimes left all behind, families, things like that. Part of that means it's important for us. It's vital to know, what did they serve for? What was the cause that launched them into service? Were they conscripted? Were they drafted? Or did they volunteer? Out of those service members here tonight that served in those roles, how many of you were volunteers? Raise your hand. Okay. And how many of you were drafted? See those hands? Okay. Let me ask a different question that I think I've heard before, and it always puts a fine point on this. How many of you, if given the opportunity to serve your country again, would volunteer now? Raise your hand. Isn't that something? Go back and That means something about this country that is really hard to put into words unless you really understand it. And again, in the funeral oration of Pericles, what had happened is these wars were raging in Greece. The city-states were battling back and forth, and Pericles was the first man to honor these fallen soldiers when they came back. And he gives a great speech on what it really meant to honor them. And he recommends that for people that didn't understand the city of Athens or the culture that Greece was, to really go back and understand what drove these men to fight, what launched them into the battlefield. And he says that it has a lot more to do with the culture and the civilization and what Greece stood for, what Athens at the time stood for. It was different than Sparta, if you're not familiar, or if it's been a little while. You know, Sparta's a warrior culture, and they were impressed into it, and they were forced into their combative roles. But in Athens, the men volunteered, the women volunteered. People were able to be poets or scientists or mathematicians. They were pressing the boundaries of civilization so they could build a greater society behind them. And this is what Pericles said made their service even greater, because they were inspired to protect that. They were inspired to make that larger, to increase the posterity or prosperity for their posterity, to pass something greater on. Now, they lost it in ancient Greece. If you remember, after the Golden Age, the empire or the republic at the time was collapsed, and they passed on those traditions to the Roman Republic, which stood up and did something similar over several hundred years, kind of increased the republic and the citizens' duty, their piety to the great Republic of Rome. Every person felt like they were bought in. They felt like they were part of something bigger than themselves. The Romans kind of landed on something that the Greeks missed, that American founders highlighted, which is that your service to the Republic, your service to your country, ought to be something bigger than yourself. It ought to be about more than just you. It ought to relate to your ancestors, and it ought to relate to your grandchildren that are coming behind you. The Greeks didn't think that way. They thought temporally. They thought in their own presence, today, for the glory of me, what can I do to make myself grander? And that leads a person down a road that is sort of ego-driven or self-driven, a warrior that's inspired from his own head instead of those things beyond him that inspire him, like the traditions, like the great culture that set this country up. That's what the Romans locked into, and that's what our founders idealized about the Roman Republic versus the Greek Republic. And that's important. And there's a reason why it's important, and it's related to this fight, this invasion, this sort of soft invasion that we're seeing now. And here's why. In the Republic of Rome, the citizen had an inherent knowledge, a sort of a transcendent idea of who he was. What he was doing there wasn't just for him at that moment, but it was also for those who would come behind. And so he respected the culture to the extent that he was willing to sacrifice, die, pay homage to his ancestors, and leave something better for his kids. That's an ideal that drove men to act in ways that were selfless, in ways that were connected to the community beyond them, larger than them. And they recommended at the time, you know, to the Roman and the Greeks, so they had a lot of gods, but they understood that this idea of something beyond yourself, something greater than yourself, this sort of mortality or immortality that happens through your line of children, that is passed on through your property, through what you can build. Those are the things that drive us and inspire us in the middle of that fight to go a little bit further, to go a little bit harder, to be that lone survivor that we see with guys like Marcus Luttrell. So when we have those ideals, we grow up in a culture and a community like America, where the founders lock onto that and say, hey, when we build this country, we want our citizens to be a part of this culture, the American Republic. And make no mistakes, from the early days of Greece all the way through the histories of political philosophy, what they knew was that we were not okay with democracies. And a lot of people kind of forget that, because we're in 2016 and everyone talks about how we're a democracy, but they warned us about the democracy and how it would be like on a stormy sea, raging with the whims of man and the opinions of one, or the demagogues would be able to take a democracy and quickly shift it one way or another. So we want to be very careful when our leaders idolize the tenets of democracy, knowing that in reality, we have a republic. We have a representative republic that is supposed to be a little bit better than that. We're supposed to be able to sustain tradition and rules, the rule of law that was passed down. And we're supposed to be able to look at those things and say they're there for a reason. And so when we disregard them, when we dismiss them, We ought to do that with deliberation. And we ought not do that just because it was the kind of the thing to do that day. It was fun, or someone came up with a great idea, a new idea. The Romans were very fastidious about old ideas versus new ideas. A new idea, we could test it out, we could trot it out, but we're testing it, measuring it against things that have happened before. What does it mean? How did it look in the past? And if they were going to roll out a new idea, they were very careful about it, deliberate about it. So something in our culture has been lost. It's been lost for some time now. And the question that occurs, I think, to people like Jim, who's going to come up here to speak, and you and Kelly, as we talked about, is how did we lose that? How did we lose the vision or the ability to talk to our cultural community, our political community, about something beyond our temporal whims, our currency of right now, and think in terms of not just now, but then, meaning respecting our traditions, and then, meaning building something for the next generation behind us. And if we don't think like that, well, you can just guarantee that you'll lose your republic. It's not possible to keep it if you don't understand that that's what it's about. I think Livy was writing in the 1st century Rome, and he was talking about this in his histories of the early Roman people. And he was writing in the 1st century, so now we've moved from a republic in Rome to basically what is becoming an empire, tyranny, sort of an autocracy. And Livy's a little bit sick about this, as many other people are, and so he says he's talking about, the best medicine for the sickness, the salve for the soul, the healing, is history. To go back and read. Because he says through that history, we can understand what has happened and how we came to the ails of our currency, of our right now. He says we can look at what men did 1,000 different times, good and bad, and then make a decision. That was good, didn't work, or did work. This was bad, and it didn't work. And so you have this laboratory behind you that has already happened that recommends positive action for you right now and into the future. So when Livy says that, he's recommending we must look at that in order to understand where we are. But he was bemoaning the fact that Rome, as a republic now, had not remembered that. And as you know, they lost the republic. Became an empire, collapsed, passed on those ideals of liberty, passed on the ideas to places like London. One of the problems is when we get to late 17th and 18th century, 19th century in Europe, and this again relates to the problem, is we begin to see something creep into our philosophical underpinnings, our foundation, the core basement of our belief. For Plato and Aristotle, who are theorizing, well, who are we? How do we be a better man? How can we govern best for all? And they think of things like, well, we have to think beyond ourselves. How can I be a good man? And if I internally don't have any mechanism that drives me beyond myself. In other words, I have to think about something beyond today's life, beyond what I can see with my eyes. I have to have a faith in something. Now, Plato and Aristotle, while they were not men of God, they weren't men of the Bible, they didn't have that at the time, they did understand that morality, the morals, and the ethics of their citizenry were the only thing that could sustain a well-governed people. So they began to incorporate those ideas, and they were synchronized or synthesized throughout the church years with guys like Thomas Aquinas and Justin the Martyr, and people that wrote through times, Martin Luther, who comes in and says something a little different. But the idea was sound, that we have a moral obligation to be the best we can as an individual. And only if I know that can my community grow. So again, we are looking at man in his heart, in his inception, as he's growing up in Western civilization, and he's beginning to think of himself not only as one person, but as connected to those behind him and those in front of him, and to his God above him. This was how man thought. This was the way Western civilization was built. And so when we look at a crisis, the red-green axis, or the invasion of immigrants and this population of people that are non-assimilating, we have to ask ourselves, how are our body of politicians not checking that? How do they not stop that? And the answers kind of go back to our philosophical underpinnings when they were shaken, when they were rocked, when they were split. When philosophers stood up in the 17th and 18th century, they began to question whether there was a soul, whether we were connected to it, or whether we had an obligation to a higher power, a fealty to anything other than ourselves. And men at the time began to conclude, because of the overwhelming amount of science that was was coming in at the time. We were looking at microscopes. We were discovering new things. Gravity, the laws of physics, and Newton, and Bacon, and all these guys. And now that we started to see things at a different level, the philosophers stood up and said, well, hey, you know, if everything's kind of a material possession, a material thing that we understand, maybe we don't have a place out there in the cerebral spiritual world. Maybe it's all right here. And they began to peel these philosophical strains away. Guys like Descartes stood up, and Descartes early on, René Descartes, a French philosopher, who basically proposes that I don't know if my soul is connected somehow to my body. If I poke my finger, I know the action happened, but how do I know? Where does that get passed from the body to the mind? Well, this shattered the world. This actually destroyed our philosophical underpinnings. It was years later that Friedrich Nietzsche stood up and questioned if man has got to the point where we don't know if there's a God, or if we've determined there is none, is God dead? He proposes it by saying if God is dead, we are now facing a nihilism, a despondency. There's nothing to live for. These are small underpinnings in the currents that begin the philosophy that ends in a place where we live amongst men who don't question those things and begin to see that their material being is what's capable of scientifically, materialistically ruling other men, governing best for all, not beholden to a creator, not beholden to their posterity, not beholden to their ancestors. New ideas trotted out from the whims of man. So we looked at this and we said, okay, once that happened, once Nietzsche proposed that God was dead, and you get Hegel and Heidegger, and you run into one of the most sensitive, I think, times for Western civilization was between the years 1910 and 1950, really. Man is now proud of himself. We've discovered this enlightenment, the reasoning, the materialism. We're very excited that we can now rule the world peacefully. And we stood up and we declared we can now have peace amongst nations and trade with each other and not have these wars. And that was before World War I. And World War I, for those of us who don't remember, we weren't there, is one of the worst disasters in Western civilization. It was bloody, it was brutal, it was violent, and it raged all over Europe, and it churned millions and millions of people in the war machine. And the hearts of man in the Western Civ at that time, and in America, and the countries that were involved were devastated. I mean devastated. Europe had come out of hundreds of years of war. They've been factions and infighting since the early days, and so they're looking to solve these problems. They're hoping to find a solution to these problems. They thought they found it before World War I, and right after they concluded, well, now we've really got it. That was the war to end all wars. We're never going to war again. They sat down in conference among themselves and they said, well, we can just have peace. We can share ideas. We can begin to corrupt the borders. We can begin to eliminate the difference between you and I. See the world together, trade together, have international commerce, and this will reduce the friction, and we won't have these wars anymore. It was a very exciting time for some people. And then we have World War II. So it was, again, another devastating shock to the heart of philosophers and political ideologues who believed in themselves and they believed in the greatness of their ideas. But they didn't give up. There was no, conclusion that now that we haven't done this, we have to live a different way. And so the generation of what we're living with today really has its roots that are deep in the heart of philosophy and man and political ideology. And I tell you that because when you get to the point, and you're going to hear Jim talk a lot about, well, rules and regulations that have changed to basically, I'll use the term flood the zone. How do we take the American culture and how do we drastically change it? How do we make it amenable to our cause? And what is their cause except that of the cause they've sought for a long time, which is basically peace at all means, peace at any cost. That's what Neville Chamberlain said in front of Adolf Hitler. That's what the British said in front of Kaiser Wilhelm in front of World War I. Peace at any cost always leads to these disasters because the cost is everything. The cost of liberty is everything you have. That's why when our founders encoded it in the Declaration, they pledged, what they pledge? Yeah, their fortunes, their lives, their sacred honor. They pledged it all, right? What else do you have? You don't have much more than that. Some of us barely have that. So this is now a time where man is reeling from the shocks of these sort of global factions, and looking to reduce those factions has become the sort of an underpinning of political elitism, if you will. So in order to not go to war with other nations, we ought to be trading with them. We ought to be allowing our cultures to intermingle. And one of the problems with that is in the America that we grew up in, or that most of us know, there was an idea of who we were. There was a thought process of how we became America. There was a recognition that our great story, the formula, was something like me, the actor, you, the actor, working on behalf of a connected community, himself, his ancestors, his posterity, that actor believing that he could accomplish a great thing for others and for himself. Lift myself up and help others. That was the formula. The formula got changed a little bit. So now the formula that we're teaching in our schools, when we had that formula of Paul Bunyan and Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone, or you get to a guy like George Washington and a story that analogizes who we are as a people. You know, did he actually chop down the cherry tree? Probably not. But it's a national myth. It's a lore. It allows us as a nation to embrace the virtue of truth and say, yeah, that's who we are. That's who our people are. It's a truthful people. Those are the ideals that we honor. That's no different than any other society. You know, the Greeks had Odysseus, and the Romans had Aeneid, and everyone's got their heroes, you know. So when you incorporate those stories, what you're training your people is you're training them to think in the virtuous terms that you hope to replicate. So when you begin to take those stories away, and when you begin to castigate or denigrate or dismiss your own heroes, whether they're Christopher Columbus, or whether it's George Washington, or Paul Revere, or Thomas Jefferson, or Abraham Lincoln, and when those heroes no longer have purchase in the public square, they have to be replaced. And when we've replaced them and changed the formula from one of action-oriented in order to uplift the community and myself to a formula of advocacy on behalf of a victim class and a plunder mentality. Plunder the wealth of others, advocate for them, and then become noble myself because of that. That's the new formula, if you haven't figured that out. It's not so new because it was proposed by a couple guys in Germany. And they wrote it down, and they elaborated on how they could do it, and they schemed and they plotted on how they could divide different groups, and they could create in the ideas in the hearts of men this idea of nobility through advocacy and plunder. And now you see our popular heroes that we used to have are gone. They're moving to the side, and the history books are recommending that we don't study them because probably they're white. White people are pretty bad. And they had slaves, or one guy had, abused a tribe of Indians. And so we have a lot of reasons why our sins have now eliminated our heroes from the history books. And that's dangerous, because when we begin to replace those with our modern histories and change the formula, we begin to go from a society of doers and believers and people who have this idea of how to build the community greater to a society of plunderers. How do I go after someone else's achievement and tear them down? And how can I make this group equal to that group by tearing that group down? That's what it's become. That's the formula. That's how we get to poor immigration policy, because you have a lot of people that don't have the understanding of who America is. And let me challenge this. If we haven't taught our kids what America is, or what the Republic stands for, or who we were, if we have now sat for 30 and 40 years with our children in public schools apologizing for America, apologizing for our greatness, bemoaning the fact that they have white privilege, bemoaning the fact that we had slavery at some point, if all they've done and all they've known is what was wrong about America, then why do we think we're going to ask someone to come into our country and actually appreciate it? Why do we think immigrants would come here and adopt or assimilate that? We don't believe it ourselves. So the challenge for us as participants in the civic community, the civic body, is the one that's challenged men from time immemorial. Is how do you change that narrative? How do you change that dialogue? How do you ensure that the children, the kids, our peers, our politicians understand that we will not release our heroes to them? How do we ensure that the shape of our message comes from us and not from those who hate us? Not from men and politicians and enemies who seek to destroy what America was. But how do we shape the message so that it's those who love what America has become that share that message? And that's the challenge. It's our job, it's our obligation, it's our duty at this point in our history. And it shouldn't be a surprise, by the way. It shouldn't be a shock to those of us who grew up in the West. When you get a little lazy, you know, you get a little soft, you got your remote control, you got your refrigerator, you're sitting there, and you know, everybody wants to watch Sunday football. That's great. That's great. But we're not pressed on the edges by barbarians. Not the way the Romans were, not the way that the early Americans were as they expanded west. Our barbarians are philosophical. Our barbarians are coming from within. Our barbarians, those who think like outside the gate people, are corrupting us and destroying us from within our gates. We welcome them in. Kelly and I had a question. We were talking about, you know, it's a little like having a TV in your house, and you've got the little kids growing up, but every night you turn on some kind of garbage, some kind of violent horror show or something like this, and you're kind of okay with it to a certain extent, but maybe you have a little edge in you. But after a year of watching it, you add some more garbage to that. You add a little bit more, let the kids start deciding what they want to watch, and pretty soon they got some pretty horrific stuff. Can we admit that there's some pretty horrific programming? Right? But by the time they're 15 and 16, it would be phenomenal for someone to come in and look at that, and you would ask the question, how did my kids get here? How did they become so corrupt? How did their minds lose the facility to measure morality in a story or something? Well, but the answer is fairly obvious to anyone who stepped back and watched it. We've invited that in our house. We've invited the destruction of the American core ideal in our homes. It's on our theaters, it's in our Hollywood, it's in our stories. You know, our heroes should remain guys like Marcus Luttrell, guys like Ty Woods, who sacrificed his life on top of the embassy, men and women who have laid down their lives to build something better. But they should also be the bankers, not the corrupt ones, but the ones that are building and lending money. They should be the farmers that are growing crops. Our heroes should be the men like Carnegie, who built steel and made the nation commerce capable. They should be men like Eisenhower, who stood up and planned the entire internet freeway system. But instead, we're watching our heroes evaporate in front of us. They're going, and before this generation's out, if we don't do something to stop that, they will be gone. They will be gone. And right now, if you were to talk to your kids and your grandkids, you have these conversations, you'll find out how close we are. I run a business called the Underground Movement. We do graphic t-shirts that do that, capture the heroes of America and the stories that made this country great. But we wanted to do it in a way that was commercial and commerce ready, so kids had something to lock onto and be proud of without necessarily having to go to Abercrombie or Hollister or some brand that doesn't give a darn about this country. And here's what happens. People have these conversations all the time. They have these questions in their head. Kids that have come out of your public school and advanced systems and private school and great colleges, and they're questioning us. Why would we honor Harriet Tubman? Why would we honor Christopher Columbus? Why would we honor William Bradford? They don't actually know the answers, so they're actually asking out of curiosity. And this should be a shock to all of us. This should actually concern every one of us out here. Because the answers of why we honor those men have a lot to do with who America set out to be. And if we lose those answers, if we can't answer that from our hearts anymore into the future, then we shouldn't expect any of these policies that affect us on the immigration front, the political front, the strategic war front. We can't expect those to be sound policies. It's not tenable. It's just not possible. So our mission is to then quickly understand, how do we pivot and how do we change it? And I feel like when most people talk about this, they're overwhelmed, it's daunting. But Livy, Livy was in the 1st century Rome, and he wrote something that's actually true. The real salve, the real medicine for this ailment, the sickness, the worry, the concern about where your country's going is history. It's understanding it so you can then replicate it, teach it out. But there's something exciting about history that Livy didn't know at the time because he didn't live in 2016, but we do. What he missed was what we got to see is the men who saved their generations. He didn't get to see men who stood up like Martin Luther and changed the world. One guy, nailing 95 theses on the door, stood up and said, no, this isn't right. But it didn't just happen once, it happened a lot. Now, Calvin, you get to guys like in the monarchy, and you get to folks that changed the world in small pockets. There was a group in Scrooby, England, who was oppressed and they couldn't worship the way they felt they needed to. And so they were kicked out of one place and kicked out of another, hunted down, arrested, thrown into jail and prisons and shackles, and their wives were humiliated. And this colony, this little band of people under William Brewster launched over to Holland because they wanted a little bit of space, a little bit of gap from the king. And in Holland, they found for 10 years the labor was hard. And this was a small group of people. They got tricked. They lost a lot of money along the way. They hired some mercenaries and some of the king's chartered men, and they floated on a boat called the Mayflower over to Plymouth Rock. Wrong place. They thought, well, we're going to land it here and do it here. And that group of guys, it was small. Women, it was small. They changed the world. It wasn't Massachusetts Bay Colony. It wasn't St. Augustine, Florida. It wasn't in New the Dutch or the French in Quebec or the people in Arizona that changed the world. It was William Bradford in the Pilgrim Colony. Those are the guys that showed the Puritans how to be tolerant, how to be different. My point is that it doesn't always have to be, however many people we have in this room is enough to do it. It can come in 1, it can come in 2, it can come in 5. There's a good news story in your history books, and it happens over and over again. 200 years later, we're still oppressed, we're still looking for freedom and our liberties, and you got another group of guys who stand up. Philadelphia, Boston, Virginia, 26 years old, Thomas Jefferson, right when he writes Declaration of Independence. That's embarrassing to me. I'm a little bit older, and I haven't done near as much. That guy changed the world, all of them did. The point is, if we're waiting for someone else to do it, it's not going to happen. If you're waiting for it to happen some other time down the road, or the next generation will get it, they're not going to get it. But the other point is, it's not harder than it ever has been. In fact, it's probably easier. There's proof this year. You've seen proof in the last 3 years of what happens when you give people hope and cause. We talked about this sort of transcendent idea, and I'll kind of wrap with this, but one of the things that Americans fight for is that there's a cause in our heart. America is a great country, the greatest country in the history of the world. And when we connect people to those ideas, they're willing to go over to Normandy and die on the beach at 10,000 a day. They're willing to launch into the jungles of Vietnam or into the South Pacific Island or into the Barbary Coast and repel the pirates there. Men that understand the cause will go and fight and die for that cause. But the cause must be just, and it must be good, and it must be transcendent. It must uplift others. In America, I talked about the philosophical underpinnings that have shaken our core. And for the last 30 and 40 years, we've been losing our cause. We're in a society now that is kind of inundated with this nihilistic idea. Nothing is of value. There is no inherent value. I am worthless, you are worthless. There's nothing to live for. This is a Western idea, folks. This comes from guys like Descartes, it comes from Nietzsche, it comes from Heidegger, but it exists today. That the only purpose is material. It's to build more things and gain more stuff and then die as wealthy as you can and beat the next guy in front of you. That's what leads to despondency. And if you're not sure whether we're despondent or not, look around. Your kids are looking for things to believe in. That's why every time someone shows them a cause, they perk up a little. Tom's shoes, cancer awareness, Lance Armstrong, breast awareness. You show people a cause, and they start to get excited. And here's what happens when you show them a bad cause. You show them a bad cause, and they start to go over to Syria and chop people's heads off. If you're not sure why ISIS is popular today or why they have been successful, the answer is because the West has left these children with no cause, with nothing to live for, therefore nothing to die for, and people are looking for something to believe in. And when you let the charlatans come in and the snake oil salesmen, they're going to give them something to believe in. But it's going to be hostile to our way of life. It's going to be hostile to our culture and our civilization. In order to repel that, to beat that, we have to be proudly vocal, unapologetic, and excited about our culture, our history, and our civilization. Only when we are happy with who we are and confident and know it at the very core of our being, that's the only way we're going to be able to turn around to the new populations coming in and say, we want you to share this with us. But right now, we're not even sure what that is. So as I wrap tonight, and I'm going to pass over to Jim, we'll get a chance to do some question and answer. I just want to leave you in your mind with that thought that this is a fight that is easier than it has been in the history of mankind. With the internet, you've got a voice. Every person has their own voice. That's what we need to do as a civic body, as a community here. Look around. You have allies on this battlefield. I'm your ally, and until I die, until I have the last breath in my body, I will fight for the survival of this country. Will you guys join me in that?
All right, guys, we're going to take just a 5-minute restroom snack break. I've got these sign-up sheets if you'd like to stay in touch and hear about what Warren County Tea Party does. Our speakers coming up. Sometimes we get on some of our elected people about not doing